The Anza Trail is well known. This is the historic trail established by Juan Bautista de Anza on his way to the San Francisco Bay Area in 1775 and 1776, with some 240 colonists, including men, women, and children. Juan Bautista de Anza was captain of the Spanish presidio of Tubac, now in southern Arizona. And so our search for evidence begins here and nearby, and then follows the route north to the general area of Picacho Peak. One of the reasons we know so much about this trail is that some of the participants left journals of this historic journey. Even a map has been preserved. Nonetheless, to date, historians and history buffs have only been able to reconstruct the broad outlines of the route. Despite discussions of people and places encountered and league distances provided, the actual route remains vague. This is because there are discrepancies between accounts in the number of leagues they were said to have traveled. There are differences in the length of leagues used. There are problems with the few longitude and latitude readings they provided. Even the map scale is such that only the excessively broad corridor can be discerned. Even though some specific reference points have been proclaimed by historians and descendants, no evidence of the trail itself or the specific camping sites have been identified. The exceptions are those that were established at known locations, such as Tubac Presidio. Some place names have survived, such as Canoa, Las Lagunas, and so on, that allow us to peg the general confines of the route, but not specifically where they walked, rode, and slept. No on-the-ground archaeological evidence has been identified, so one suggestion is as good as any other until actual physical evidence can be connected to the journals and map. My goal is to remedy this by taking account of what people think they know and by examining existing evidence, such as road segments at Tubac Presidio, and finding new archaeological, physical, and geographic evidence of the actual trail and campsites, whatever character that evidence may entail. This is the first of many planned videos on the Anza route and the archaeological evidence of the actual trail route and campsites. This video covers what I have been able to discern so far, based on limited work undertaken during the first few months of COVID. I have new data on only a few of these locations and will focus on these places where new evidence is available, but I'll give a brief outline of all the encampments between the border and just south of Picacho Peak. Las Lagunas is the first location discernible of the expedition from diary accounts north of the modern international line. Las Lagunas has been restored over the last few decades to a wetland oasis. Little is said about Las Lagunas except that Padre Font simply mentioned the name when having arrived there. From there, they traveled on to Tumacacri Mission, where Font found both Padres Garces and Exarch, who were to be his companions on the expedition. They stayed the night before proceeding to Tubac Presidio to join up with Anza and the rest of the expedition. Some places related to the Anza expedition are known locations, like Tubac Presidio, where the ruins remain to this day. Portions of the trail were used through time and so are still visible today on the ground surface. Even Father Kino used these trails in the 1690s and early 1700s, as did the natives before him.
I'm standing on a very old Arizona road. This road is the road that goes from Tumacacri Mission to San Javier. Everyone travels up this road. The Juan Bautista de Anza expedition to California will come right up this road as they ride into the Presidio. From the Presidio, they will launch to California, to San Francisco. And it all started on this old road. Fortunately, we're lucky enough that some of it still exists today, and you can see it running right up here.
I'm walking on the actual Anza Trail. Every time I walk this trail and I come to this point, I'm amazed. I get goosebumps. Look at the trees. They form a canopy and a tunnel that leads out to this beautiful field that's been farmed for thousands of years. This is what Anza and his people would have seen. The river is just beyond, and it's awesome.
The Spipriatum, ancestors of the Wakatum at San Javier, also once lived along this portion of the river and the trail.
I'm standing right here on the Anza Trail, and when you look around this place, this is what my ancestors, the Saburatum, the Subipriatum, would have seen and traveled on this route, especially when they were trading up and down the Santa Cruz River. So if you take a look around, you see what it really looks like. I know all along the Santa Cruz it looked like this, and right now what the Santa Cruz looks like further north is nothing compared to what it looks like here near the Anza Trail. And I think my ancestors, of course, anybody that comes here would really appreciate the beauty of this place. It's just incredible. You got to see this.
Most Anza expedition campsites are at important springs or water holes that have been used and remembered for centuries, as is the case at Canoa. This is the camp called Canoa. This is the first night north of Tubac. It's the last reliable water hole between here and San Javier del Lac downstream. There's a vast dry expanse between here and there. So this was a regular stopping area for travelers. This was called La Canoa because it was a reliable water source. There was a well here, or a natural spring, and from it they took water off with a trough called a canoa. The expedition camped here in the late afternoon, and later that night the wife of the soldier, Manuela, gave birth to a son named Juan. He made it to California, but unfortunately later that night, or actually early in the morning, she died of complications from childbirth. She was buried at San Javier del Lac. The actual campsite was probably on a raised area of the floodplain, and as such, most evidence of it would have washed away. Nonetheless, artifacts are present that may indicate the area of the campsite. Anza tells us in his journal that the Llano Grande, or Grand Plain as he called it, was 4 leagues north of Canoa and 8 leagues north of Tubac. But we can't be sure where it's located, since Garces and Font give a different figure for Punta de los Llanos, or Point of the Plains as they called it. They placed this location 3 leagues north of Canoa. Even today, no one agrees where Point of the Plains is located. It's thought that this camp location was a dry camp without water, which makes it more difficult to locate than some of the others, but it is likely near Sahuarita. The expedition passed through the Atum village of Huac, where the Franciscan Mission and Church of San Javier del Lac was located. Padre Francisco Garces was the resident minister here, and he also accompanied the expedition to San Francisco. These images show what the native village seemingly looked like at this time. It was configured in this way for a brief period, and then the residents redistributed themselves into more traditional housing within a few years. Font states, "This is a pueblo of Sabipri Pima Indians." They then halted a league north of the pueblo of Chuxon, which was a visita of San Javier. This is the namesake of modern-day Tucson. Chuxon was described as being larger than that of San Javier del Lac at this time. The Subipriatum settlement of Chuxon has been identified at the base of Tumamoc Hill, not a mountain or Sentinel Peak. Consequently, the location of the Anza encampment can be inferred from league distances from this known location. This would have placed the Anza expedition near the Sweetwater wetlands. I'm standing in the area of the first encampment north of Tucson, where the Anza expedition camped for the night before heading through the gap in the mountains. This was called Whipped Plain. The reason it had that name is because 2 of the muleteers had defected, and Anza put out word to the local residents, including the natives, that there would be a reward if they were returned. And so the first of these deserting muleteers was returned here, and he was whipped. He was given 12 lashes, hence the name, Whipped Plain. This would have had shade and water, and so would have been a relatively pleasant place to camp, whereas further north the water got scarcer and scarcer as the Santa Cruz River waters dipped below the sand. The trail was a known trail. Natives had followed it for centuries and maybe even millennia. And the Spaniards were also familiar with the trail because this was the route they took back to Tubac from the San Francisco Bay area. The trail led to the confluence of the Colorado and the Gila rivers, the area that we know today as Yuma. Here you can see the gap through the mountains. It's north of Rattlesnake Pass. This area today is known as Los Morteros and is the site of a prehistoric Hohokam village. But mixed in with this are the uses and occupations of centuries of settlement and encampments during short visitations. Anza's people would have been very pleased to settle in for the night at the relative beginning of their arduous journey. We're standing in El Puerto de Azotado, or Whipped Pass. This is one of many passes through the Tucson Mountains. And the reason I think this is the pass is because, first of all, it's the northernmost. It would allow them to stay near the Santa Cruz River for the longest period of time where they had a reliable source of water. This is also one of the places where the last of the water would have been on the surface. Very short distance north of here, the water would have dipped below the surface and therefore would have been unavailable. And since they knew this from their native guides, they would have stayed as close to the river and the shade as possible before moving through the gap the next morning. But also I think that they went through this pass because of this cross pecked into this rock. These expeditions often left intentional markers of their passing. Sometimes they planted crosses in native settlements or on top of hills. Other times they carved messages or crosses into trees. And then sometimes they left messages carved into rocks, either words or crosses like this one here. We see this throughout the Spanish area. Sometimes they would bury a jar or a gourd with a message in it, a handwritten message in it, so that the next person or group that came by could read of their progress, or they could tell them something important about the journey. This occurred during the Coronado expedition over by the Colorado River near Yuma, where one of the expedition members left a note in a jar and carved on a tree that there's a note buried here. And the person who came by afterwards, Diaz, read the note and knew that that part of the expedition had been there, had found nothing, and had already returned. So there was no need to look for them. They had already returned. This particular carving was pecked into the rock. It's a simple Latin cross, which would be expected for the time. First of all, because it's simplest to peck a simple cross or a Latin cross into the rock. It also has some damage here and down below, although at the base this may be representing a platform that crosses were often set on. So this cross here, I think, is a marker of the passing through this gap of the Anza expedition. This is the second cross that seems to mark the location of an Anza encampment and also the route or the trail between Tubac and the Yuma area, the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers. This is an ancient trail, and it seems that Anza and probably people before him followed this trail, and these markers seem to indicate where they camped. And we can't know for sure whether Anza's priests, the priests that went along with Anza, carved these, or whether they were already there, but they did mark places where you should stop, where you could get water, where water was reliable. It's very likely that the priests who were along with Anza put these crosses in place kind of as a blessing for the encampment and for the travel that they were making, and also to commemorate their passing through this area. They may have also carved these crosses simply to mark the trail on the way back in 1774, so that when they brought the colonists with them the following year, they would have a clearly defined route with clearly defined camping places. Whatever the case, they correspond with expected campsites. I think this cross occurs at or very near the water features that are described as rain lagoons, rain pools, basically, water catchment features, where they were able to come through the area where water was lacking in the Santa Cruz River bed, but nonetheless find reliable water here, as the Otham had for centuries. Their Otham guides showed them where these were, because they're slightly back from the river. But these would have been reliable, and they would have been formed in such a way that they would have held water, so that travelers who came through would be able to depend on the water here. This is one of the low areas where water collects. It may be a natural playa. You can see the rocks that have been fired, or fire-cracked rock, all across the surface here where people have had fires. In a couple areas you can see distinct features like this one. This kind of fire pit is what you would expect for the Anza expedition as well, because they had to cook. Probably not as many rocks as in this feature, and the rocks would have not been used to this degree, but nonetheless they would have looked something like this. The cross is located nearby and seems to mark the general location where the encampment for the Anza expedition was located. The documents indicate that they were on the west side of the Santa Cruz River. There was an abandoned village located a half league or about a mile and a half from where they camped. This, shown here, is probably that Otham encampment. It was said to have 30 jacales, or structures, huts, basically. Here you can see the outlines of some of them. The Otham who lived here were two-village Otham. They lived along the river seasonally, and then they would travel east to the river during the farming season and back to the west for the rest of the year. As a result, their housing is much more temporary than that of the Viper Otham, who lived, for example, in the Tucson area, and who were full-time riverside residents and farmers. The words that Anza and Font were attempting to capture as the village name were not likely Old Town, as Anza stated, but rather something more like the Otham words that mean follow or follows and priest or father, so follows priest.
We often say oit far, oit far.
This suggests that perhaps the residents followed the priest to one of the larger riverside mission settlements for protection, perhaps, against the Apaches, as commonly occurred at this time. This would explain the abandonment of the village. This ends our journey for now along the Anza Trail until new data accumulate.